For over 50 years now, the urban and national identity of Singapore has been wrapped up in the image of the garden. It's a city that likes to see itself as incredibly dense and ultra-modern, whose concepts of urbanism are shaped by common ideas of land scarcity on its small island. But it's also a city that sees itself as dedicated to the cultivation of urban nature, and which has tried to define itself through the imagery of plant life. In Singapore, the idea is that the concrete and glass high-rise should grow out of the manicured garden, which acts to obscure and soften the brutality of urban expansion and which creates vistas of soft landscapes and elegant views. This city-beautiful idea of urban growth lies at the core of official urban planning with respect to the way that the state relates urban growth to the public. Over the decades, the approach has gone by several names. But at the heart of this strategy is the mid-century belief that Singapore is to be a garden city. It was an idea drawn from the language of colonial urban development and positioned as a response to Singapore's political reconstruction of the 1960s. In 2019, I contributed a chapter about Singapore's garden city planning to a book called The Culture of Nature in the History of Design. It was about how designers have historically made use of cultural concepts of nature in their creation of the built environment. And in that chapter, I wrote about the early development of the garden city in Singapore and how it was incorporated into certain lines of thinking about the politics of development since the 1960s. But I also tried to show how the idea became diffused and was ingrained in the public mind, whereby the idea of the garden city could essentially be used to convey any concept about the creation of a high-quality, modern lifestyle. On its surface, the idea of the garden city is often about planting trees and gardens in city or town environments. Since the time of Raymond Unwin in the early 20th century, it's defined the landscaped aesthetics of the suburban environment. And in Singapore, it was largely the same. It was about visibly planting trees. But the 1960s in Singapore was an especially tumultuous time, and as a policy for shaping the city itself, the garden city was drawn into other debates as well, and could be read as standing for the total unity of all of Singapore's plans for modernisation and national construction. Singapore had gained Home Rule in 1959, and from that point it was the People's Action Party under Lee Kuan Yew who led the government and decided Singapore's internal development. The city had long been a global trading centre, given its position within the British Empire as a conduit between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. But the new government had to immediately begin responding to the concerns of a United Nations Commission report that their economy, which was almost exclusively based on trade commerce, was putting Singapore in a potentially dangerous situation. In response, they set out with schemes to expand local manufacturing and design. They also began to reform public housing models to expand the city and relocate populations, and they began to stamp out political opposition, particularly from the left, which was a response to the Chinese communist insurgency in what's called the Malayan emergency of the 40s and 50s, as well as British concerns about the wider spread of communism in Southeast Asia. So already at the start of the decade, physical and social change was being made in Singapore. In 1963, Singapore then became fully independent of Britain, and it joined the newly formed Union of Malaysia. At that point, they had to negotiate the transition from being a discrete crown colony to being just a region in a larger nation-state. They had to deal with the fact that they were a largely ethnic Chinese city in a country of Malays, which seemed to be pushing towards a Malay-first style of racial policy. But while this caused anxiety, the union also provided much excitement, as Singaporean planners expected that by the end of the decade, they would be able to take advantage of a Malaysian common market, which they hoped might expand their manufacturing power and secure Singapore as the economic centre of Malaysia. But then in 1965, the situation changed again in a sudden turn. In the delicate language of Singapore's politicians, the city gained independence. In the language of Malaysia, the city was ejected from the Union for being disruptive. But however one frames it, the island city now had to establish itself as a separate nation apart from Malaysia, and as a global trade centre without a hinterland. The separation meant that Singapore's government could act solely in their own interests, but they also faced a great deal of uncertainty and concern. Some, including the United Nations, thought that there was no hope of Singapore surviving on its own. There were a range of speculations over what disasters might occur next. Would Malaysia send in an army to reclaim the city as their own territory? Malaysia also controlled Singapore's water, so might they cut that off? Could Indonesia, who had opposed the forming of Malaysia, decide to claim Singapore for themselves, given that there had already been Indonesian terrorism in Singapore several years earlier? It seemed possible at that point that Malays living in Singapore might demand to be restored to Malaysia, or that the Chinese would demand closer connections with either Maoist or Republican China, and that racial tensions would escalate. And when the United Kingdom announced the withdrawal of its Singaporean military base, the uncertainty of security on the island only grew. Given all of these hypotheticals and the suddenness of Singapore's push into nationhood, one can understand why the political language of the late 1960s turned into a rhetoric of survivalism. The country developed a public language of crisis that extended much longer than the crisis itself, and which became a model for the social engineering of a new Singaporean society, aiming explicitly to create a rugged character, a new national identity that was hard-working, willing to forego luxury, polite and respectful, and committed to the government's plans. A nation of these people, with their commitment to their nation and government over their historical ethnic identities, would avoid crisis and allow their country to survive. It's in the midst of all of this that the idea of the Garden City emerged, and the idea, of course, was motivated by all of these concerns. For this reason, I don't see the Garden City as an isolated policy or even as being particularly focused on its main results, which was the growing of plants and beautifying the town. Instead, the Garden City was a popular idea that engaged with a range of other policies and debates that were begun at that time, and together they aimed for nothing less than the invention of a new nationalism, as they dealt with the independence thrust upon them. For example, the Garden City's greening of the city contributed on two fronts to the early efforts to secure the economy through economic diversification with manufacturing industries and economic investment. On one side, newly planted trees were specifically used to reduce dust in new industrial estates, providing them an agreeable physical character. But also, the orderly gardens of the city were intended to give confidence to foreign investors that Singapore was stable and well organised, and thus bringing money into the country. The Garden City also contributed to new housing policies, because garden landscaping encouraged the adoption of higher density buildings, and it softened the brutalist style of the Housing and Development Board's slab block building style, making the residential landscape agreeable. The Garden City was valuable as well for the physical education of the new Singaporean, contributing to what became the Sport for All campaign, which aimed to shape the ruggedness of the population through the cultivation of a culture of athleticism. Pleasant urban environments would lead to people going outdoors to exercise. Exercise would lead to a fit and healthy population, and this would build a strong industrial workforce to take part in new economic schemes, and, after the introduction of national military service, a strong national army. The Garden City was about plants, but its effects reached to influence a range of other new policies that aimed at ensuring the security and continuation of the nation, given the uncertainty that was then felt about their situation. In this sense, I don't view the Garden City as a single idea about urban planning and beautification, but instead, I think it needs to be viewed as just one part of an interconnected series of official plans to reinvent the city, to reinvent its people, its economy, and its outlook, and to mould a new national landscape. The idea of the Garden City in Republican Singapore really started to take shape in the middle of 1967. This was the point when the Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, first used that specific phrase to describe the government's ambitions, and from that point, the phrase gained common adoption throughout the press. But this wasn't really the start. In 1963, when Singapore was still part of Malaysia, the city's government was starting to push its own tree planting campaigns. They also started to plan the redevelopment of Raffles Place in the city centre, with the intention of developing city gardens that would shore up the image of a complete and developed city. This project was finished in 1965, and already at this point it combined the creation of a city garden with novel urban amenities, this being the first underground car park in the city.
Over $500,000. The garden not only converts this important shopping centre into a place of beauty, but also affords many facilities to shoppers. There's a shaded walk from one side of the place to the other. There are benches and seats at convenient places, green ribbons, flowers, and ferns. The giant Japanese star clock, which cost almost $60,000, is already a great attraction. It's reputed to be so accurate that you can set your watch by it. With the opening of the new underground car park, there will be no parking problems for those visiting Raffles Place. There's room for 150 cars. Two stairways lead from the parking area to the garden, and there's a subway to a new basement supermarket. Everything for the convenience of visitors and shoppers.
This gives us a sense that the garden wasn't only for the sake of greenery, but that it was also imagined as being the showpiece of modernisation. But at these early stages, the different ideas of developing urban nature were still quite limited and quite separate from each other. The real success of 1967 was that it took these different approaches and gave them a single title that would show their singular approach. They were all part of the Garden City, a term that came to define a unified vision of Singaporean urbanism. Obviously, the phrase Garden City calls to mind the work of Ebenezer Howard and the English Garden City movement at the turn of the 20th century, and that approach to the city did result in tangible developments in British Malaya and Singapore. The first government planner in Malaya, Charles Reid, was an active member of the Garden Cities and Town Planning Association, and he actively promoted the ideas of Ebenezer Howard and Raymond Unwin in relation to Malayan development. Defined garden cities were built in Malacca in the 1930s and in Singapore in the 1920s. But it does seem unlikely that Lee Kuan Yew was thinking of these specific examples when he used the phrase in 1967. Instead, he was more likely recalling local instances of the Garden City revival from the mid-century, when the concept of the Garden City was incorporated into the idea of the British New Town, which itself came to serve as the physical model of Singapore's public housing schemes. After the international revival of the Garden City in the 1940s, a number of regional new developments, both in Singapore and across Malaya, called themselves garden cities, and they all made use of modern forms of architecture, including high-rise towers. For these developments, the Garden City was a sales technique, but they secured a relationship between the idea and newer concepts of modern development. The Garden City was new again, and it implied the modernisation of the urban environment. And in the late 1960s, modernisation is what Singapore desired most. The notion that by the late 1960s the Garden City had more broadly reached popularity and that it had come to imply modern development is shown by the fact that Singapore wasn't the only city in the region insisting at that time that it could become a garden city. The Malaysian cities of Kuala Lumpur and Kuching made similar assertions, and smaller commercial developments continued to use the phrase to advertise and to promote modern living environments. But it was in Singapore that the idea really became ingrained, and where the planning policies required really took hold. The first part of implementing the Garden City was through official efforts by government departments. This is why, when the Prime Minister first introduced the idea in 1967, he was addressing street cleaners and their supervisors. The aim of the speech was to convince them to work harder and not complain about it, because as street sweepers, the cleansing department was conducting work that was of national importance and would begin the process of reshaping the environment and the country's living standards. The first concern of the Garden City was to start cleaning up, and the state began a process to introduce public dustbins on city streets, to make sure that every household would have their own bin, and to ensure regular garbage collection. He launched what he called the nation's attack on the rubbish creators, and painted a picture of a tidy and orderly environment with nothing out of place. An environment that would therefore look and feel more pleasant, but would also be healthier because it would reduce the spread of pests and disease. Over time, official efforts to promote urban cleanliness continued through the banning of street hawkers who tended to fill drains with food waste by moving them into purpose-built food centres. There were also significant increases in fines for littering and vandalism, and campaigns to eradicate mosquito breeding to prevent dengue, which also included fines for allowing any still water to be left sitting. All of this by the 1980s had led to the international cliché of Singapore's cleanliness. In order to manage the wider greening project, new government departments were organised, and a specialist workforce of horticulturalists and landscape designers were recruited. After the early founding of a new trees and plants unit, by the 1970s, a wider parks and recreations department was established with different arms that covered all sides of the Garden City. The Botanic Gardens was positioned within this department, which had the effect of starting to move them away from their purely scientific work and incorporating the Botanic Gardens as a key player in the implementation of policy. Now, this was a big step in the government's efforts to align a single state voice, given that just a decade earlier, the head of the Botanic Gardens had expressed dissent over plans for industrial expansion in the West on the grounds of conservation. But alongside the Botanic Gardens in the Parks and Recreations Department, there were also parallel divisions for other tasks, like horticultural research, the management, cleaning and decoration of the landscape, and also a design unit for new garden planning and construction. As the Garden City's official workforce grew in the 1970s, more specialised botanical experts were able to revise and improve advice of what kinds of plants should be supplied in state nurseries. Government departments, developers and individuals could no longer be left to plant whatever they wanted. They needed to find plants that would be hardy enough to grow roadside, trees that wouldn't die for being planted on median strips in the middle of highways, and also trees that were unlikely to shed branches into oncoming traffic, something that had started to become a real problem. It became apparent from rather early on that just planting trees wasn't enough. The Garden City demanded a large workforce that could provide constant maintenance and repair, and this is where public participation became very important.
Keep your city like a bin. Put your litter in a bin. Stop disease this simple way. Think about it. Start today.
After the limited results of the government's planting policies of the early 1960s, when the Garden City took form in 1967, it was already clear that it wasn't something that could only be the work of state departments. It required the support of the people. A commitment to the greenery and cleanliness of the city was a value that needed to be instilled. If we think of the way Lee launched his Garden City through his attack on the rubbish creators, the rubbish creators that he was attacking were the citizens of Singapore. It was their wider practices, habits and attitudes to the city at that time that he wanted to eradicate in order to allow for his green and clean city to be established. The Garden City was therefore about physically transforming the urban landscape, but it involved remaking community values as well. It was a way of creating civic behaviours as part of establishing a new national identity. The project began with public education campaigns about standards of hygiene, and the public were put to work cleaning up their own environment. Community centres were put in competition with each other to see who could create the most beautiful community gardens. The same approach was then taken at the scale of the housing complex. Beautiful block competitions motivated people to tidy up and lay their own gardens, always in a competitive mode, where the gardens always had to be getting better. And in 1971 a National Tree Planting Day was inaugurated. Public cleaning schemes alleviated the work of the cleansing department. Tree planting days alleviated the work of the Trees and Plants unit. The public was slowly being turned into the Garden City's unofficial labour force. The planting days and public competitions gave people reasons to become involved in gardening, but it also required a wider public knowledge of the skills of gardening. Policymakers argued that basic botanical knowledge should feature as a standard part of children's education, and it was put upon teachers that they were responsible for instilling a love of nature in children. To develop a culture of gardening in adults, this book was published in 1971. It's one of a couple of gardening books that were printed by the Ministry of Law and National Development, written in English and Chinese, which explain the care of the officially selected plants for public gardens. By the middle of the 1970s, tax incentives were given to support personal gardening. The cost of creating gardens on personal property, if that garden could be seen from a public space, could be turned into tax credits. The scheme imagined personal gardens as a part of the wider public image of the city. This, of course, benefited people who lived in houses with front yards rather than the people who were moving into the new high-rise housing estates, but there too people gardened. The common corridors of housing estates were allowed to be taken up with gardens of potted plants, and still this is a common sight in Housing and Development Board flats today. Gardening was becoming a national hobby. Apart from having the benefit of spreading out the work, the real motivation behind the different schemes to involve people in the cleaning and beautifying of the city seems to have been to solidify connections between the citizenship and state. As I said earlier, there was the exaggerated concern of the government that the people were ready to abandon not only the governing party but the new country itself, and that a Singaporean state was untenable. Planting trees and clearing walkways was about creating values of care and respect for the places that people lived, and, by extension, the state. Planting trees and clearing walkways caused people to have a personal investment in the creation of the government's vision of a future Singapore, making the metaphorical idea of nation building into a series of practical tasks where everyone could demonstrate their own involvement through the presence of a garden and a swept corridor. And of course this involved the state exerting control over the public, redefining the expectations of citizenship and the acceptable values that people should hold. From the beginnings of national independence, particularly with a concern for economic growth, Singapore's government believed that their people needed to develop a keener sense of responsibility. They wanted them to be harder working, persevering, less indulgent. They wanted the rugged Singaporean. Gardening was promoted as a recreational activity, but it's still work, particularly when it's directed to realising specific government plans. It could be enjoyable, but it would also instill the value of hard work. This was a case of the state mobilising leisure time and turning it productive. The very same process was also happening at that time in official sporting mass participation campaigns. Sports were a valuable recreational activity which could take place in the newly landscaped and planted city, and this was precisely because they weren't only for leisure. Sports were for training a physically fit and enduring workforce, just as gardening supported the cultivation of a work ethic. The garden city, along with other public schemes, was being used as a disciplining measure. But even with the growing sense of state control, it wasn't hard to view the changes brought by the garden city optimistically and see real improvements in lifestyle and environment. People were positive about the changes, because like the building developments of the 50s that used the name, the National Garden City still stood for the Modernization of Singapore. And modernisation was a key concern of Singapore's economic, social and spatial development. At the end of the 1960s, shortly after the Garden City had been established as a convenient way to contain and express much broader urban strategies, another phrase was fed into the public's consciousness. This was the idea of gracious living. This wasn't really a policy, and it really never had a defined set of principles because it was used in the press in so many different ways. It was more of a public debate. But journalists picked up on the phrase because it was used by the Prime Minister to talk about the character of citizenship, really to make the point that Singaporeans needed to conform to a pattern of being gracious, courteous and hardworking. The same idea that was being pursued through the garden, through sports, through labour and through foreign investment. Similar to the Garden City, where he took the term from earlier ideas about local planning and extended it to the scale of the nation, with gracious living he seemed to be using the language of early century household etiquette primers for hosting parties, which in the 1950s had been filled with a preference for modern appliances and household technologies. And again he extended these concepts for the home to the whole civic sphere. Gracious living up to the mid-1970s became a rallying idea for the popular discussion of Singapore's modernisation and the civic values that should go along with this, aiming to guide the character of citizenship through a period of physical upheaval as the structures of the city and daily life changed. Gracious living, though, is a topic of its own. My reason for mentioning it here is the way that it and the Garden City started to become entwined in the early 1970s. Certainly, the planting of trees was a form of urban redevelopment, and an appreciation and respect for nature was meant to be part of the national character, so the connection does make sense. But gracious living tended to be more about modern urban infrastructure, amenities and personal acquisitions. Highway flyovers, new cars, cinemas, air conditioning and wealth. In time, some journalists tried to argue that the best of living, and therefore the most gracious living, was education, art and cultural appreciation. The director of the Botanic Gardens proposed that the value of gracious living was a pleasant and relaxed life, and that as such, in his words, even lolling under a tree could be gracious living. The way that discussions of gracious living developed in the early 1970s shows how the values of the Garden City had already become ingrained, and that the pleasure of the garden was being wrapped into a discussion about a good life, alongside infrastructure, urban amenity, leisure, and modern luxuries. The Garden City was positioned as an aspect of national modernisation, and even as discussions of gracious living receded from public view, the Garden City maintained its connections to technological and infrastructural modernisation. In some ways, the rhetoric of the Garden City absorbed that of gracious living. We see this spelled out in a postcard produced by the Singapore Tourism Promotion Board, which was made to launch a competition in about 1982. The front of the card presents Singapore as a garden city, where one is always close to gardens and tropical plants. It also makes the point that the city is safe and that the people are friendly and courteous, something that also comes out of gracious living and the National Courtesy Campaign of the 1970s. On the back of the card there is a printed message, as though written by a traveller, which describes this garden city. And the points it focuses on, in addition to the lush greenery, is the city's efficiency, its economic standing and modernity, as well as ethnic cultures and shopping. This was very much in line with the Tourism Board's image of the country at that time, which was starting to find that promoting the city through the image of late 20th century modernism, albeit with tropical plants, wasn't working too well. And so they were starting to transition into an image that juxtaposed modernist urbanism with traditional Chinese, Malay, and Indian cultural imagery. But at this point they're still holding to the image of the Garden City, and very clearly the Garden City wasn't only about plants. It included the city's economic management and its standing in comparison to Western cities, and also the high quality of the recently completed Changi Airport, then a centre point of the international promotion of Singapore's Garden City. So by this point, the Garden City was nothing less than the complete modern image of Singapore. It was an idea that could accommodate, connect and make sense of all of Singapore's approaches to modernisation, not just its dedication to images of nature in an urban environment. Certainly this sense that the Garden City had become more than just a policy of maintaining greenery in the city was borne out in the 1980s. By that time, the earlier concerns that the Singaporean nation was unstable or uncertain had drifted away in reality, if not always in popular rhetoric. The nation's economy and international relations were stable and indeed progressing well, and sociologists had shown that the government's early concerns that the public would reject the idea of Singaporean nationalism and split into rival ethnic categories with different allegiances, thus justifying the need to construct a new sense of citizenship, were greatly unfounded. The early concerns of the Garden City had been to clean up the streets, create a sense of order, and to establish an appreciation of urban nature. But as the problems of national independence had faded away, and the initial practical concerns of cleanliness and the respect of greenery had been popularly accepted, the Garden City policy could change and grow. In the early 1980s, planners began to announce a new phase of the Garden City. It was far more decorative, which spoke of the progress that the city had already made. They were going to focus a lot more on growing flowers and planting fruit-bearing trees. It was their plan to fill the city with the colours and the scents of the garden, improving the beautifying qualities of the Garden City. This was a difficult plan, because flowering plants are more difficult to grow, and fruit growing on roadside trees tends to be left until it ripens and falls onto the pavement, causing a mess. This is especially the case after a decade of telling people that to strip anything from public plants was vandalism. But even today, it's common for overpasses to spill flowers, and you will occasionally see people cutting papaya fruit from public trees. Through the 1970s, though, the professionalism of public planting had been greatly developed. Rather than the habits of the early tree planting days where it was anyone planting anything, more horticulturalists and botanists were engaged by the government in order to better determine which plants were suitable for the public sphere. Which plants would grow best, which didn't have roots that would cause damage, which trees wouldn't so easily shed branches onto public roads. They were making the garden city a professional pursuit. This was the reason for engaging workers at the Botanic Gardens in urban planting schemes, and for establishing a new school of ornamental horticulture in 1972, which would train new landscape designers who would be able to ensure the longevity and practicality of the government's aims. Through this period, Singapore's government also employed foreign landscape architects to bring their expertise on major projects, like the Japanese designer Rem Koolhaas, who made landscape improvements in major city parks and the grounds of the government istana. At this time, the Garden City lost some of its vitality and radical change, though it still involved major expansions of public parks and demonstrated how the idea had become integral to the national image of Singapore. By the 1980s, the Garden City wasn't some start-up aspiration, but a well-staffed operation. And through this period, it isn't really possible to imagine new roadways being built without roadside plantings, new infrastructure without garden beds, or even major buildings without hanging gardens of some limited kind. About a decade after this, there was a revision to the Garden City policy. It was relaunched under the title of The City in a Garden, which Lee Kuan Yew, who by this point had handed the prime ministership to his successor, referred to as just a bit of wordplay. And he was fairly right in this. The City in a Garden didn't change things dramatically from the second phase of the Garden City approach. Instead, it seems more a reaffirmation of earlier principles and a rededication to the principles of shaping the city through the garden. This reassertion, as framed by Singapore's strong financial position as one of the Asian tiger economies, eventually led to a couple of large and rather prominent projects which were intended to cement Singapore's identity internationally. The first of these was Gardens by the Bay, which opened in 2011 and is very closely connected to the Marina Bay Sands development. This is a central city public garden built on reclaimed land, which includes a number of outdoor gardens as well as indoor biospheres, which use artificial climates to showcase foreign plants that otherwise couldn't grow in Singapore's tropical environment. For the past decade, this has featured as a key image in Singapore's international tourism promotions.
The second is the more recently completed Jewel building, which opened at Changi Airport in 2018. This again provides an indoor air-conditioned forest spanning 5 stories and connected to shopping mall facilities. Its most remarkable feature is the waterfall that descends from the glass canopy into the floors below. And currently another project is underway. This is to be a memorial building dedicated to the first generation of Singapore's national politicians. It was announced in 2017 and isn't built yet, but it's to be located in the eastern extension of Gardens by the Bay. The location was chosen for being close to water, to represent Singapore as an island, and it was chosen for being in the garden, to represent the commitment to the idea of the Garden City, which the politicians it will commemorate originally introduced. More recently, however, in the middle of last year, the Garden City was relaunched yet again. The city in a garden, it would seem, is gone, and now Singapore's continuing approach to the urban landscape is to be known as the city in nature. Like former policy shifts, this will come with an expanded program of new nature pathways, gardens and tree plantings, and hopes to have no citizen more than 10 minutes from a park. It's being framed as a response to climate change and the need to clarify divisions between nature reserves and areas of future urbanization. The language of this change suggests a transition from the manicured grounds and the monoculture plantings of previous decades to the creation of areas resembling the jungle, swamp and wetland native to the island, with wildlife and a greater range of local plants. 20 years ago, environmentalist concerns about the way that the expanding city with its neat gardens was destroying long-standing nature in Singapore and damaging the local ecosystem were largely dismissed for not being pragmatic enough. The city in a garden policy was only committed to a certain type of nature. But today these same concerns are difficult to ignore. The new city in nature is the response, and it marks a desired transition away from constructed nature to regain the forms of primitive nature that were largely lost in Singapore through the half-century of urban growth and controlled gardening. It's an interesting response, because in a way it's both continued support and rejection of the old garden city. Clearly it reconfirms a belief in city greenery and proposes to expand this. But also, the problems that it will try to correct and the types of planting that it will work against are those that developed under decades of the guidance of garden city planning. The difficulty in talking about Singapore's garden city planning over the past half-century is just how wide-reaching it has been, making it at times seem ambiguous, and at other times more like a series of interlinking stories rather than a single progression of an idea. For example, here I haven't been able to say much about the way that the garden city was used in tourism campaigns, or the way that it was used to introduce foreign visitors to the city on their drive through a jungle highway. I haven't been able to say much about the land extensions, or the different designations of major parklands, or the conservation practices involved. I also haven't been able to say much about the early garden city that existed within the sphere of the English garden city, and the particular role that undeveloped colonial landscapes played in the thinking about the European urban environment. What I have tried to do is to focus on the early stages of the national garden city, where the idea of city planning was extended to the scale of the state, and where Singapore's newly independent government decided to adopt this idea as a device for inventing their own nationhood. I've tried to show that what began as an ambition for an ideal, clean and green physical environment had motivations that extended from the processes of decolonisation, and which were aiming to secure the very survival of Singapore as a nation. It provided a sense of control and alleviated a feeling of crisis within the government. And I've tried to show that in creating a new environment and a new nation, it aimed to remake a national population, redefining their values, attitudes and behaviours. In this sense, the garden city in Singapore could be said to be establishing control and disciplining the civic environment. In the work I wrote for the Culture of Nature and the History of Design, I think I largely characterised the garden city as a rhetorical device. This was, to a great extent, because of the sources that much of this material has been drawn from. Information about the garden city presented itself in political speeches, public information campaigns, newspapers and magazines, therefore as popular discourse about the future aspirations of Singapore. And given Singapore's population, this happened in multiple languages at the same time. But in this case, the different languages don't suggest too much difference. The Malay Bandaraya Taman, for example, seems to mostly be a straightforward translation of the ideas of the English garden city. And this probably reflects the government's control over their ideas for future planning. The discussion was mostly shaped by official sources, but there was still room for journalists and letter writers to propose their own ideas. And thus, in an evolving discussion, the scope of the garden city could grow and contract over time. I think the sense of the garden city as rhetoric has also been conveyed here, though what I hope I've added in this lecture is the greatest sense of how the policy of the garden city was closely related, and in many cases actively aimed to support, other policies and debates that were also being developed by Singapore's government in the 1960s and 1970s. The outcomes of the garden city related to policies of industrialisation, housing reform, foreign investment, lifestyle modernisation, or gracious living, sports promotions, and the late 70s courtesy campaign. In Singapore, there wasn't really different public campaigns and policies for different outcomes, they were all the same. They were all addressing different facets of society and the economy, with the intention of combining to achieve a single vision for the country's future. In some respects, then, we might view the idea of the garden city as a containing policy. It aimed to define the physical environment of Singapore and to shape the landscape and practices through which all of these other policies were enacted. It holds together all of the other ideas about the city's future and in that sense it was the ultimate version of what the state hoped their country would be. And so we can say that both physically and socially, Singapore has been defined by the image of the garden in the city.